Okay, good afternoon, and thank you to those in attendance to our press conference here on day one, week two of COP29. The pace has certainly shifted since the first week, and we'd like to present to you today an overview of the situation and some startling new data on the costs of extreme weather impacts, and also how taxing big oil and gas companies can certainly help fund loss and damage. We have three speakers on our panel today. I'll introduce you from my right to left. Tracy Cardy, climate politics expert at Greenpeace International. David Hillman, Director of Stamp Out Poverty. And Shiva Goundan, Head of Pacific at Greenpeace Asia Pacific. I'd like to now hand over to Tracy.
Thank you. So the new finance goal that will be agreed here in Baku needs to significantly scale up public finance to pay for urgent and rising costs of adaptation, mitigation and loss and damage in developing countries. And it must be a watershed moment for making polluters pay, not least the fossil fuel industry. Because we're currently at a moment in time when carbon emissions from fossil fuels have never been higher. Fossil fuel industry profits are monumentally high, and more people than ever are suffering from a rapidly changing climate in what's on track to be the warmest year on record. Above all, people in the world's poorest countries and communities that have contributed least to this crisis and are paying the highest price. So last year, just 7 major oil and gas companies made $148 billion in profits. In July to September this year, Shell made $6 billion, while Exxon made $8.6 billion. Month after month, the fossil fuel industry are reaping the profits of climate destruction, while climate change takes lives, homes, and displaces millions. Month after month, they're taking the profits while we take the pain. And I think climate destruction has never been so profitable, and the human cost of those profits so pronounced as they are today. So we need leadership from governments to hold polluters to account and harness this vast wealth for climate action. In terms of the status of the negotiations on the new collective quantified goal here in Baku, they're very challenging, and they're now in the hands of ministers to resolve. And over the next couple of days, Ministers Yamin Fuad from Egypt and Chris Bowen from Australia are going to be facilitating consultations. They'll be focusing on the very politically contentious issues, including structure, quantum, and the contributor base. Now, overall, in terms of the NCQG, we are concerned that developed countries are pushing for an all-encompassing, poorly defined global investment goal to be the centerpiece of the NCQG, with public finance to developing countries a mere sub-goal. And as yet, they've said very little on the scale of either. On making polluters pay specifically, there is some hope lies in the fact that momentum is building, and there are draft proposals on the table that include recognition of the need for new sources of finance targeting the fossil fuel industry and other high-emitting sectors. And we've heard many governments over the past week speaking in favour of solidarity levies underpinned by the polluter pays principle, as well as the UN Secretary-General. And these proposals, they need to stay and they need to be strengthened, because this new goal will set the terms which determine who pays for climate action in developing countries over the next decade and beyond. And it would be manifestly unjust if the world's biggest polluters were spared any expectation to contribute. So as Greenpeace, we're saying to governments, do not let the fossil fuel industry off the hook. The new finance goal must make polluters pay.
Thank you, Tracy. I'll hand the mic over to David now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm David Hillman, Director of Stamp Out Poverty, co-author of the Climate Damages Tax report released in April of this year, and I'm delighted to be launching this important briefing, Paying the Price, here at COP29, which is a collaboration between Stamp Out Poverty and our good friends at Greenpeace, and I'm very pleased to be presenting its key findings to you. By way of introduction, echoing what Tracy said, according to the WMO report launched at the start of this COP, 2024 is on track to be the hottest year on record, with extreme weather events wreaking havoc on communities and economies across the world. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said a few days ago, climate catastrophe is hammering health, widening inequalities, harming sustainable development, with the vulnerable hit the hardest. This briefing throws a spotlight on 6 climate-induced extreme weather events from this year, spanning the terrible floods in Kenya from March to May, and there were floods as well in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil around the same time, to the terrible heat wave in India around May, June, to Typhoon Karina in the Philippines and the region that includes Taiwan, to much more recently Hurricane Beryl, and you'll remember Hurricane Helen really recently in September hitting the US Caribbean and Mexico. These events span superstorms, heat waves, and floods, with our research assessing the cost of damage at least $64.6 billion, which largely falls right now on the people on the ground. It's they who are actually paying for it. People who were not responsible through their actions for the catastrophic climate change that has befallen them. This briefing juxtaposes the $64.6 billion cost with the huge profits by 7 of the world's largest publicly traded oil and gas companies, whose adjusted earnings in 2023 I'll read out. ExxonMobil, $38.6 billion. Shell, $28.3 billion. Chevron, $24.7 billion. Total Energies, $23.2 billion. BP, $13.8 billion. Equinor, $10.4 billion, and Eni, $9.2 billion. Clearly, the excessive profitability of the fossil fuel companies means that they can afford to pay much more in tax. And under the polluter pays principle, most agree that they should be taxed considerably more as a matter of redistributive justice. The companies need to compensate the communities, the populations that have been damaged by their actions, which is where the climate damages tax comes in. The climate damages tax, or CDT, as I'll be calling it from here on in. There's now a growing head of steam behind this CDT proposal. It's one of the leading proposals under a serious consideration by the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force, and that's an initiative led by France, Kenya, and Barbados. And by the way, last week here, Mia Motley was doing a session, we were both in it, on the solidarity levies, and this really does have a head of steam, and it's great to see leaders like Mia Motley behind such ideas. And its purpose is to mobilize additional grants-based finance for climate action, most particularly loss and damage, where the considerable funds raised could contribute to the Loss and Damage Fund, which was agreed here at COP27, with a proportion kept by collecting countries for domestic spending on the transition to green jobs, energy, and transport. So let me quickly explain the CDT. In a nutshell, it's a simple but potent idea. Most fossil fuel producing states have royalty arrangements with the companies that extract fossil fuels. The companies are legally obliged to declare the volume of fossil fuels that they extract and pay a fee to government based on that volume. What we've found in further research, actually to be published next year, is that over the last 20 years or so, trillions of dollars have been raised in this way. So the CDT is not something new. It is proven. It's a sure way for governments to raise revenue from the fossil fuel industry. The CDT effectively piggybacks off this established collection regime. Our figures from this report that the briefing draws upon, the Climate Damages Tax report, shows that at a starting rate of $5 US per ton of CO2e, the CDT would raise an estimated $900 billion by 2030, with the tax base being the richest, the OECD countries, who, due to their historical culpability for climate change and their ability to pay, need to go first, furthest, and fastest in mobilizing urgently needed and long overdue climate finance. So in conclusion, correlating the costs of catastrophic climate events that I referred to at the beginning of these words from this year with CDT income, correlating the two, we find that looking at year one CDT revenue, taxing Shell's 2023 extraction would have essentially covered the cost of Typhoon Karina from this July that devastated the Philippines, Taiwan, and other countries in the region, as I'd said. And taxing Total Energy's extraction would cover the cost of Kenya's floods this year nearly 30 times over. So what are countries waiting for? They need to implement the climate damages tax. They need to make the polluters pay. There's no time to lose. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, David. Power research into that report. We'll hand the mic over to Shiva.
Osa kerea na ve vakulungatataki me ve ira na nungu ngase. Osa kerea na ve vakulungatataki ni nungu vanua tambo. Kauvosa ve kemuni e na vukungu ke na vukui nungu Pasifika Lomani. I ask the blessings of my ancestors, I ask the blessings of my community, and I speak to you with my and for my Pacific. I'm not sure what you guys all think of this space, but for me, it is so disconnected to reality. I can keep saying things like we want special circumstances of small island developing states and least developing countries to be included in the finance goal, which, by the way, is not a charity, but rather an important part of the Paris Agreement. You just have to look at Article 9.4. You can't just pick and choose what suits your narrative when it comes to the Paris Agreement. I can keep saying things like it needs to be mostly grant-based so that we do not increase the debt burden of our Pacific nations. When it was time for the developed countries to come and strip bare from our countries the resources and cultural history of our place, profit from our extreme naked vulnerability, then there was no question about who takes the benefits, on how the benefits will be taken, and what principles it will be taken with. I can keep saying it needs to be in the trillions, that it needs to include loss and damage as a sub-goal, because the fund we currently have is primarily empty to what is currently needed. I can keep saying, as someone from small island developing states, that we need a huge focus on the principles of transparency, accessibility, and disenablers. I can keep saying that you need to make access easier for our communities, because the last thing they want to do after a cyclone is stand in huge lines of a destroyed bank building to try and get some immediate cash to buy food, water, and shelter equipment just to put a Band-Aid solution on the destruction left behind. But this is not how our people talk. This is not how communities understand things. What do I say to our communities and our people when I go back to what currently has been an extremely frustrating COP? With people not understanding the realities of the most vulnerable regions, or just so disconnected that the true human spirit dies in this at times soulless place. As we talk now, Philippines and Northern Pacific is getting devastated by typhoons. Mexico is on the path of catastrophic storms, floodings in Honduras, South Sudan, etc., etc., etc. We say this every COP. Now we can talk about how many people directly die from these human-induced climate impacts, but it will never be accurate because so many die as a result of diseases, food insecurity, health issues that follow it. No amount of quantum, very fancy word, but the process is not fancy at all, can quantify lives lost, lives destroyed, but most importantly, the dignity taken away from our people and our communities. I think it becomes sexy now to hear graves are being swept away, our islands are underwater, the child is still missing from this cyclone, this mother couldn't go to hospital to give birth but lost both her life and a child's life in a weather event. Just think deeply, if you're a parent here and your child could never have the opportunity to actually speak the language you speak, a huge part of someone's spirit, because they don't live on the lands anymore. Think about someone who has to change their whole life or whole way of living, what they eat, because they cannot grow any crops because this land is inundated with salt water. Think about the community that has picked up the pieces from one devastating cyclone and 2 days later gets hit by an even more powerful one. Think about the people who had to carry people with disabilities from their homes near the sea to an evacuation center up the hill so that they don't lose their lives. Think about the first responding women who goes to check if everyone is safe in the neighboring communities, only to find out their family member has died due to the trauma of the event. And I can keep going one by one by one. Just try quantifying someone's years of trauma that follows these events. 100 billion was the floor. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that there are individuals with net worth more than the combined mitigation, ambition, and loss and damage efforts developed countries are stating as the goals. Our Pacific communities, actually I'll take liberty to speak on behalf of all small island developing states that are not the cause of this climate crisis, but you cannot argue with me that they are not the ones who have paid the most for this, and paid very dearly, and many with their lives, and the dignified lives of the future generations. So who should pay? The fossil fuel industry has gotten away with murder or complicit to it. Instead of taxing or putting levies for their crimes, the governments keep subsidizing, providing space for their presence, and promoting their agenda. This burden of taxing our people needs to be shifted, and shifted soon. Survivors of the climate crisis shouldn't have to pay for this crap that they didn't create. The moral and action compass on this needs to shift to the perpetrators, and that is the fossil fuel industry. Let me leave you with something. In the last year and a half, I've been present in 4 cyclones, 1 tropical storm, and 1 king tide. And we as Pacific people have had to tell that story of devastation over and over and over again. It is always heartbreaking to keep having to delve deep into the experiences that should not define us, but that's what the world defines us with. Our people are resilient people who will not stop until we stop this mess. We stand proudly on many of our people's graves to continue this fight. We will fight for the reparations and finance necessary for our mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage needs. We'll make sure that the people who have given us the privileged responsibility to represent them get the justice they deserve, and that justice is a life of dignity. Vinaka Vakalevu.
Not sure how to respond from that, Shiva. I'll open the floor to some questions for those who have a question to answer. I have one question, perhaps, and just explain to me again, how does a CDT actually work in practice, and can a uniform carbon price be effective? There's a question? Yep.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk today. My name is Nathaniel Launer. I'm a 3L at Vermont Law and Graduate School studying climate change litigation. I was wondering, as you talk about the CDT, what in your mind is the biggest barriers to governments implementing this tax? Thank you.
Do you want me to take it? Well, actually, as I was explaining, there's no huge barrier in that they already implement it. Although this is going to be coming out next year, as I was saying, trillions have already been raised in the last 20 to 30 years from countries like the US, Australia, and many, many others. So the skill with this really is that it's easier with innovative solidarity levies to go to taxes that already exist. That if a country doesn't use it right now, they can look across and go, oh, this is how it's done. And for those countries that already do it for their tax ministries, it's really not so complicated to add 0.1% or add a percentage increase to something that already exists than try to introduce something that's new. So in terms of the kind of issues, feasibility, desirability, and political will, let's break them down like that. In terms of feasibility, it's solid. In terms of desirability, it's clearly needed, and it's left with political will. And that's why I mentioned Mia Mottley, and I mentioned that there are now governments that are seriously looking into this because they know that they need additional money that's not been harnessed before, that needs to be there for grant-based finance specifically. It needs to go to loss and damage, which cannot be funded in any other way. Aaron, what was your question? I forgot what it was.
We can come back to that, but if there's any other questions from the floor, I can come back to my questions shortly. Yes, down in front.
I've just got a question about how you envisage fairly allocating any funds that you would generate. I mean, how would you choose what climate events need to be addressed? Is there like a standard or something in terms of when it would qualify for assistance? Oh, sorry, I'm Stephen Wynne-Jones. I'm a journalist with Sustainability Online.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first instance, we would be wanting funds to go through UN climate funds. Dave has mentioned the Loss and Damage Fund. There's always, well, it's now the Responding to Loss and Damage Fund, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. And what's important about these funds as compared to bilateral flows of finance from government to government is that developing countries themselves have a stake in how those funds are governed and how the finance is dispersed, and that makes them fairer. So most definitely we'd want to be seeing the bulk of the finance going through UN climate funds, and where they're going bilaterally, we want to ensure that the spending of finance is community-led and that communities are really at the forefront of directing finance so that it meets their needs. Thanks.
Yeah, I just might add to that in terms of funds channeling through the UN systems or the funds that are already established. But there has been talk a lot, especially for small island developing states who find it very hard to access these kinds of funds, that there needs to be a reform of the international financial infrastructure. That's been a push that's been led by the developing countries, and that is something that is actually needed so that the money goes to the places that actually need it. There's also special flows that has been pushed by small island developing states and least developing countries, and that will be something that will be the talk of Baku in the next week. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got time for one more question. I might go back to my original question then, David. How does the CDT work in practice, and can a carbon price be effective?
Well, I think I explained that it already is there in practice, in that these royalty arrangements already exist. So it's just, as I said, a question of political will. We have suggested in the CDT proposal starting at $5 per tonne of CO2e, which is a low rate to start it off, but our research has shown this would be the easiest way to ease it in, and that it should, in fact, have an escalator and grow by $5 per tonne each year for the succeeding years, for the following years. I wanted just to come back to the question before, if I may, on eligibility. I mean, my colleagues on the panel were saying that it should go through UN funds. We definitely would agree. In the CDT proposal, we talk about funds from the CDT going to the Loss and Damage Fund, and they're coming up to the next board meeting. I think it's just about to happen, but there is eligibility criteria for developing countries to ensure that the neediest countries and communities get the funds they're the ones that get funded. So yeah, that is a space that is worth all of us looking at, because we want to make sure that those eligibility criteria are the fairest that they can be to serve the communities worst affected.
Thank you, David. That is very helpful. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to speak to you a little bit about the fact that protests by Greenpeace groups and survivors of extreme weather have taken place in a number of countries in the past week, from Austria, Belgium, France, Italy, Norway, Romania, South Africa, Spain and the Philippines. They've been confronting big oil with furniture, toys, family photos and other items from tragedies that emissions from dirty companies, energy companies, have created. Through these global actions, we are calling on the climate talks here in Baku to finally make climate polluters pay for the damages their products are causing. Just outside this press conference room, we have a number of Greenpeace representatives who have also brought some personal items and artefacts and climate impacted objects here to Baku, and they'll gather to unveil these items just outside here. So I invite you to come and meet and speak with them and hear from their stories as well. And our speakers, particularly David, will be available for more details on the report, and Tracy and she will also be available outside the press conference room. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.